Everybody, today we jump into Unit 4, Day 5, and we're going to be talking about President Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, you see, we spend a whole day on him because there's going to be a lot of changes during his presidency and a lot of things being different during his presidency, as we're going to have our first really kind of homegrown president, rags to riches president. We talked about that idea of the self-made man last class, and you're going to see that Andrew Jackson really is the first of these kind of self-made men. And this is also known as a democratic revolution because you're going to see that our government is going to change and that the government is going to be known as more belonging to the common people versus just the wealthy and the elite. So there is an article for you to read that compares President Jackson to Trump. This article is from the last election cycle before Trump was elected. And you're going to see that there are a lot of comparisons between these two guys in their temperament, in their campaigns, in the way they went about themselves. So much so, you'll see that the picture there of Donald Trump up in the background is a painting of Andrew Jackson, which he had put up in the Oval Office when he moved in there. So encourage you to check that out and see the comparisons between them. And I told you, I think on the first day of this class, about the comparisons of the election of 1824 and the election of 2016 and how similar those were as well. So, rise of political parties during the Jacksonian era. There's a video for you to watch here about the election of 1828. After the election of 1824, when Andrew Jackson has the presidency basically stolen from him by John Quincy Adams, you are going to see that moves us into the election of 1828, and Andrew Jackson would easily win this over John Quincy Adams. Here's another video for you to check out on the age of Jackson that helps you provide a good context. It's from Crash Course. So, democracy in early America. So following the American Revolution, you're going to see only 2 states allowed all male taxpayers to vote. In those states, generally the poor and the middle class accepted the leadership of the wealthy and said, they might not have liked it, but they have accepted it. Notables, which would be, your politicians, that kind of thing. They manage the elections usually by giving loans to small farmers, businesses, storekeepers, treating tenants to rum at election time, and a variety of different methods. Oftentimes they were able to bribe voters. Hey, you vote for me, I'll give you this rum, and that kind of thing. And usually only the wealthy and the powerful family connections ran for office. It kind of reminds me of today that you see pretty much the wealthier the people running for office, even in our country today. But that is how things were during that time. Now, democracy advances. You're going to see in the 1810s that you're going to have the push to start to expand suffrage. Maryland reformers challenged the notable-led system. They condemned property qualifications as tyranny. And in order to diffuse the situation, you're going to see Maryland and other East Coast legislatures start accepting a broader franchise, which means they start allowing more people to vote. More white men, I should say, allow them to vote. Women, African Americans, still not going to be included in that. So how would this change politics? Well, this can change politics in a big way in that politicians now have to start focusing on how to reach a common person, somebody that they might not have a lot of general connections with. And now they have to figure out how they can get that person to vote for them and how they can show that person that, hey, I'm just like you. Just like you, I understand your struggles. I put a picture here from the election of 2004 of John Kerry, who ran as a Democrat in that election against George W. Bush. It was funny. Throughout the campaign, he constantly wore Carhartt jackets and boots and that kind of thing, and tried to represent himself as one of the common people, doing things like this where he'd go out shooting, which it was funny because in reality, he was actually a wealthy dude from Connecticut who windsurfed and didn't really, I'm sure he didn't wear Carhartt a lot in his normal life. So again, that shows you even today, politicians are going to try to pander to the people, to normal people, to get them to vote for them. And we all know that right now because we're in the middle of an election cycle. Corruption was still present within the system. Entrepreneurs and speculators demanded government assistance for their business enterprises and paid bribes. So they said, hey, you do this or we're not going to vote for you. Bankers would give shares of stock to key legislatures, and speculators would often win land grants by paying off members on key communities. So just like politics is today, it was back then that there was a lot of corruption in it. Some would turn to politics to advance their religious and cultural agenda. You can see there an example of Utica, New York, where they restricted some certain things there. So politics, again, we tend to idolize the past as far as politics, but politics has always had an element of corruption to it. Martin Van Buren, he would be the chief architect of the system of party government, first at the state level and then at the national level. And you're going to see as we talk on about how he was instrumental in creating this whole idea of a party government. He was a lawyer. He didn't like the idea or rejected the idea that political parties were dangerous. And he said, all men of sense know that political parties are inseparable from free government. So he said, political parties aren't necessarily bad, and political parties can be used to an advantage. So he starts in 1817 to 21. He turns the bucktails in New York into the nation's first political machine. He would actually buy a newspaper to promote his platform. He would use patronage to gain support, which patronage is the idea of you reward campaign supporters with certain things. And the spoil system was used for the first time on a state level. Again, spoil system, rewarding campaign supporters with jobs, patronage would you be part of the same thing, but patronage is also rewarding voters with certain benefits. So again, this is going to be your first political machine. In the election of 1824, which I had mentioned earlier, you'll see the Federalist Party was non-existent. We talked about everybody kind of went over and migrated to the Republican Party, and the Republican Party was split up into various factions. 5 candidates would all run. Only 4 of them would make it to election day. One of them had, I believe, a stroke, so he couldn't participate in the campaign anymore. If you look here on the map, you're going to see Andrew Jackson gets the most votes, and Andrew Jackson gets the most electoral college votes. The issue is that he didn't get the number of electoral votes needed to win the election. So that means the election would go to the House of Representatives. Now you got to understand, Andrew Jackson, very crude man. A lot of men did not like Andrew Jackson. In fact, it was Thomas Jefferson who said he was alarmed at the prospect of General Jackson becoming president. So Jackson would win that. Again, it gets thrown to the House of Representatives. John Quincy Adams, who knew a lot of these politicians, he had grown up around D.C. and around these politicians his entire life. They end up giving John Quincy Adams the presidency through what is known as the corrupt bargain. Henry Clay had been the Speaker of the House, and shockingly, John Quincy Adams is picked as president, and then who does he make his Secretary of State, which would be obviously an upgrade from Speaker of the House? He makes Henry Clay. So Andrew Jackson, again, calls that the corrupt bargain because he says, look at this, I got more votes, I got more electoral college votes, and I lose the election. So Henry Clay and his American system. So Andrew Jackson wins. Again, this is going to be in the back of his mind. Of course, he's going to run again in 1824. Henry Clay's American system. So this is going to be Henry Clay's idea of bringing the country economic prosperity and how to do that. And it's going to have 3 rungs to it. 1, the idea of protective tariffs, keeping in place protective tariffs to help protect American manufacturing and to help raise revenues to build roads and canals and that kind of thing. So using the tariff, not just to bring in money for the government, but so the government can inject that money back into the country. 2, a national bank to provide a national currency. Again, that's something that the Federalist-leaning people wanted to bring back for a while. And then internal improvements. You'll see that the tariff and the bank have been put in place by 1816. And with these internal improvements, they had hoped to, again, build more roads and build more canals. Presidents Madison and Monroe vetoed acts of Congress for internal improvements because the Constitution doesn't specifically say that is a power of the federal government. Remember, they're the old school Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans, and they constantly veto that. 1824, though, is going to be the first election, though, where you're going to have when you're not going to have one of these old school Jeffersonian Republicans being elected to the office. So the American system under John Quincy Adams in 1824, you'd have the Second National Bank. and the regulation of state banks and use of tariffs to build roads and canals. So, like I said, you're going to see now that John Quincy Adams is in there, you're going to start to have this American system put into place. The South would reject this system, of course. Madison had rejected the bonus bill when he was in there in 1817. Jefferson condemned Adams from his deathbed and did not like this use of the American system. And Martin Van Buren declared it as unconstitutional. So clearly, even though you have this one Republican Party, it is very, very divided in their views of the American system. So Adams and tariffs. Tariff of 1816 placed high duties on the import of English cotton cloth. Who did this help? Businesses in the Northeast that were producing cloth. Tariff of 1824, another protective tariff for New England and Pennsylvania to help protect against the import of iron goods. So you're going to see a lot of Southerners can be very unhappy with these tariffs that they felt like were put in place to benefit the North while raising the prices of things in the South. In 1826, Van Buren and his Jacksonian allies, again, this is the side that's against tariffs, will propose higher tariffs on wool, hemp, and other imported raw materials. How would this help them? Again, this could help them in two ways. One, it would help them with the Southern vote because increasing a tariff on these items right here that the South was producing, that would be good for the Southern vote. But also it would help them in the North as they're trying to gain more votes in areas like New York for the next election. It would help them because people in the North would see them like, oh, they're friendly to tariffs and be more willing to vote for them. Finally, that brings us to the Tariff of Abominations. The Jacksonians, so they would end up joining with Adams and Clay to enact the Tariff of 1828, which significantly raised the duties of raw materials, textiles, and iron goods, which again, it raised it in such a level that it really did hurt the South. So the South is going to be absolutely enraged. They estimate that this tariff would cost Southern planters about $100 million a year. Again, you think about it, the South isn't producing a lot of their own stuff. When you put in place tariffs, it does increase the price of goods here in the United States. So Southern farmers or Southerner planters and Southerners in general are going to be very angry. Now, Southerners would blame John Quincy Adams for the tariff because he was president during that time. Plus, a lot of Southerners already liked Andrew Jackson. They liked his view on land rights against the Native Americans. And so, again, they're going to side with Andrew Jackson in this, even though you're going to see the Jacksonians actually helped put in place this tariff, but the blame gets put on John Quincy Adams there. Adams, very much like his father, he wasn't known. He was known to be very, very blunt, to say his mind. And a lot of people didn't like him for that. And with this tariff, instead of, being somewhat conciliatory towards the South, reconciliatory, he would not do that. Adams would be quick to question the wisdom of the people and basically say, oh, the voters are dumb. Like they don't know what they're talking about with that. That's obviously not going to work very well when you're running for president. I love this campaign poster here for John Quincy Adams, like John Adams, but Quincier. And yes, he was very much like his father. So the election of 1828 happens. John Quincy Adams says, if my country wants my services, she must ask for them. Yeah, not sure that's going to sit very well with the people. Jackson, with the help of Van Buren, would be the first to use modern day styles of campaigning. The Jacksonians now, again, you're going to see they stop calling themselves the Republicans and they call themselves the Democrats. They push for equal rights and popular rule. And again, equal rights for white men, not for everybody as of yet. And you can see the results of the election of 1824 there. Jackson wins and wins very, very easily. You can see there in New York, which had been one of the key states that I was telling you about there, and him helping support that tariff would get him some support from New York. So what would be Jackson's agenda? One, enhance the authority of president over Congress. One thing with Andrew Jackson is that he really does push the idea that the president should be the central authority within our government. He wants to destroy the American system and ordain a new democratic ideology. And that's why this era is going to become known as the age of the common man. Andrew Jackson himself, a common man, but you're also going to see he's going to fill his government with common people. And you can see in his campaign poster there, they call him a man of the people, and even going with his nickname, Old Hickory. Again, like this old hickory tree standing very, very firm for what he believed in. So, some other things with his agenda, he had what was known as the kitchen cabinet, where he used the spoils system to pick high-level members of the government. Again, the spoils system is the idea to the victor goes the spoils. So, since he won the election, he can pick his people that he wants. Again, using patronage and rotation in office, again, which goes along with that, with the idea of spoils system, the idea of rewarding those people who support you. And he used a system known as rotation of office. He said it's bad to have constantly the same group of people in government. We should rotate that out and have different people. And I noticed when you as a class had a chance to make your own amendments that a lot of you put in there amendments to limit how long people could be in government, which I think a lot of Americans would stand behind. He also, again, wanted to destroy that American system, get rid of all these ideas of national transportation stuff, and get rid of all this internal improvement. So really, even though you're going to see Andrew Jackson is different than Jefferson, he's saying, and his agenda looks very Jeffersonian-like, about the idea of limiting the power of the federal government. So one of the first big things that he's going to have to deal with is this nullification crisis. Jackson gets elected, but that tariff of abominations was still in place. South Carolina also had issues, or you're going to see in South Carolina, you have issues over the fear of slave rebellions. The slave population, as it did in many places in the South, actually outnumbered the white population. And so there were worries about that. There were also worries about the end of slavery. We talked about the Missouri crisis earlier on. So in 1832, new legislation was passed that actually kept the high rates from the tariff of abominations. South Carolina, other southern states had hoped that would be gone, but it was kept. So South Carolina would call a state convention and adopt the ordinance of nullification. And again, this is an idea that came from those Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, something that Jefferson and Madison had put forth. And basically, the doctrine of nullification is that if a state government doesn't like a federal government law, they can nullify that law and not follow it. So with this ordinance of nullification, they declared the two tariffs in 1828 and 1832 null and void. They said they would not collect those in South Carolina after February 1st, 1833, and threatened secession if federal officials tried to collect the tariffs. So they said, we're not going to collect the tariffs, and we will eventually secede if the North, or if Jackson and the federal government want to force us to do that. And again, remember, we talked about secession before. At this point, it had only been mentioned by northern states. At this time, you're going to see southern states start to mention it. Now, with nullification, nullification, again, would be based on first the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, but also you'd have John C. Calhoun, who would write the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. And in that, he would favor a state and local view on the Constitution, basically a states' rights view of the Constitution. Now, the interesting part about this, John C. Calhoun, of course, is from South Carolina, but he is also vice president of the United States at this time. So you're going to have eventually have the president and the vice president who disagree very, very strongly on these tariffs and on the idea of nullification. Jackson's response to this, he denounces the idea of Calhoun. He renounces this idea. He says that nullification violated the Constitution and could possibly destroy the Union. So Congress passes the Force Bill in 1833, which said the president could use the military to compel South Carolina to obey national laws. So he's basically saying, hey, South Carolina, you follow the law, and if you don't, we're going to send in the military to enforce that. South Carolina's response to this, well, they would actually nullify the Force Bill as well, saying, nope, you can't do that either. Jackson, though, eventually to appease this crisis and make things better, Henry Clay, who would be known as the Great Compromiser, he would step in between the two sides and be able to work out an agreement for that, where they would push this compromise bill that would reduce tariff rates, eventually making South Carolina happy. Now, again, this is a very, very important scenario here, because you're going to see this is really the first time outside of the Whiskey Rebellion that you're going to see the federal government really flexing its muscles with the state and saying, no, you are going to do exactly what we say. This idea of nullification, it's basically, we're not going to agree with that interpretation of the Constitution, and you are going to do what the federal government said. So what is the result of this crisis? South Carolina resented nullification of the tariff. Interestingly enough, though, they did keep in place the nullification of the Force Bill. It addressed the economic concerns of South Carolina and the South while holding up the principle that nullification was illegal. And you can say in some ways that it postponed a civil war that would eventually be about 30 years down the road from this. So again, Jackson, somebody who many of his views are Jeffersonian in a sense, but in this situation, he favors the side of federal power over state power. More impacts of Jackson. Second National Bank had been founded in 1816. It was a privately managed bank that held a 20-year charter from the federal government, which owned 20% of that. And again, main purpose of this was to stabilize the money supply. We talked about before when the National Bank charter expired, how state governments took it over and had their own banks and how that wasn't overall good, and that contributed to a lot of different issues with that. So basically, the Second National Bank was to keep the state banks accountable during that time. There is a video here for you to check out of Jackson's bank war. So in 1832, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, they persuade the president of the bank to seek an early extension. Again, the extension wasn't needed at this time, but they wanted that. And they did this for a very specific purpose and for a political purpose. 1832, you're going to have an election happening during this time. And their goal was, because they knew how much Andrew Jackson hated the bank, they said, look, if we try to get it rechartered early and he refuses to do that, he vetoes it, that could cause a split in the Democratic Party, which could cause Jackson to lose the election in 1832. Jackson would veto this, but with his veto, he would include a message. And you're going to see that this is something presidents basically since then have done, where they do what is called the signing statement, where they veto and then they say why they vetoed it. Andrew Jackson is one of the first ones to do this. He said in his message, Congress had no authority to charter a bank as it was subservient to the rights of the states. So here you have Jackson again going with a states' rights interpretation. He said the second bank was dangerous to the liberties of the people as a nest of special privileges and monopoly power. And he evoked nationalism and patriotism by saying, like, look how much stock in the bank is owned by British banks. Any institutions like this should be purely American. And really, you're going to see the major reason why Andrew Jackson hated the bank is this point number 2 that he made, was that it was a nest of special privileges and monopoly power. He didn't like it because he felt like that it benefited the wealthy, and that's all that it benefited, and it didn't help the people. And that's a major reason why he wanted to get rid of it. You can see him slaying the many-headed monster, which is the bank there that he is trying to destroy with his cane. So that brings us to the election of the 1832. Clay and Webster, their goal of hoping to divide the Democratic Party would kind of work, but overwhelmingly it would be a failure. It does the opposite. Their rechartering of the bank does the opposite of what they thought it would do. John C. Calhoun actually steps down as vice president. Again, makes sense because of the disputes that him and Jackson had. Martin Van Buren would be chosen as the new vice president, and you're going to see Jackson wins easily in the election of 1832. And Jackson, again, is going to use this and say, hey, the American people definitely wanted me, so now we are going to go down the path that I see the future of America going. So the bank war would heat up. 1833, Jackson calls on Roger B. Taney to destroy the bank. The bank at this point still had 4 years left on its charter, so he couldn't just get rid of it. So Taney withdraws the government's gold and silver from the bank and puts it into state banks, which got the nickname Jackson's Pet Banks. Jackson, even though a lot of people looked at this transfer to the state banks as probably being illegal, Jackson said, look, the people elected me. They elected me by a wide margin. And he claimed what is known as a mandate. He said, I have a mandate to do this. And because I have been reelected and the people did it by so much, it's clear that people want me to get rid of the bank. And you're going to see that's something that presidents claim basically from this point on. They said, hey, the people elected me, so now I'm going to do what they wanted me to do. If I was saying this is my viewpoint, then that means that's what they wanted to see happen. And that's why you're going to see a lot of criticism, such as in this painting, which is one that you will see in APUSH all the time, of Andrew Jackson there standing on a torn up copy of the Constitution. And a lot of people viewed him in that way. And then he got the nickname King Andrew from his opponents. So March 1834, Jackson's opponents would pass a resolution that censured the president and warned of executive tyranny. Again, when you get censured by Congress or something, basically there's no power behind it. They're censuring, saying, hey, we don't like what you did, but at the same time, there's really no power. It's not like they're removing you from office or anything like that. Jackson would ignore those critics. He would get rid of or veto the rechartering of the bank in 1836. And you're going to see at this point, Jackson had destroyed Hamilton's banking system and Adams and Clay's American system. So mission accomplished. And that's why I think there's a great irony today that Andrew Jackson is on the $20 bill, which is a Federal Reserve note, because Andrew Jackson hated the bank. So I don't know what the history is, why they've decided to put Andrew Jackson on there, but it is a great irony given how much he hated the bank during this time. But he is successful in destroying that. And with bringing down the bank, he brings down the American system. Now, the other area of Andrew Jackson's presidency has to deal with the Indians. Many whites wanted the Indians moved because they wanted the land. A small minority, wanted protection of Indian culture. And of course, the natives are not going to like these ideas. So what do the Indian lands look like during this time? You're going to see in the old Southwest, in like Georgia, Tennessee, those areas, the Indian groups that are there. During the War of 1812, of course, Andrew Jackson, I think we mentioned this before, he had forced the Creek Indians to give up millions of acres of land and had fought a lot against the Indians within Florida. In fact, when he was running for office, there was the rumor started by his enemies that he killed Indians and drank their blood, which we have not been able to find any truth to that in history, but it was something that they used against him. You would see that the leadership of the tribes by this point is often mixed blood offspring of white traders and Indians. And you'll see that some Indians had actually adopted institution and lifestyles of the Southern planters, including owning slaves. Again, that was rare, but you did see some doing that. So earlier in Jackson's presidency in 1830, Jackson had pushed through the Indian Removal Act of 1830. It gave money and land in Oklahoma and Kansas to Indians who would then give up their ancestral holdings. And the government promised and said, hey, you go to that land, we are not going to bother you again. If anything, you should know, don't believe what the government promises you. And in this situation, obviously, we know how that worked out in the end. In 1832, you're going to see Black Hawk, who is pictured there, and his followers, they refused to leave. So Jackson would send troops to expel them. Jackson or Black Hawk would really would realize, okay, it was probably a mistake to do this. And offered to surrender. Jackson would refuse those offers of surrender, and you would have 850 of 1,000 warriors killed during what is called the Bad Axe Massacre there. So again, you're going to see the natives here getting the raw end of the deal. Now, you would have some Supreme Court cases involving the Indians. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1832. John Marshall would deny the Cherokee claim of an independent sovereign nation and stated that the Cherokee Nation was a dependent nation within the United States. So basically all he said is, Cherokee, you aren't your own country, but you are a group of people within the U.S. that do have your own little nation. But again, you still fall under U.S. laws. And again, another thing to point out, this is 1831, 1832. John Marshall, still Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Remember, he was nominated by John Adams, our second president. Worcester versus Georgia, 1832. You're going to see the Marshall Court actually sides with the Cherokee against the state of Georgia and holds that Indian nations were distinct political boundaries within the authority granted by the U.S. So basically saying that within these certain areas that the Cherokee nations could have their own political boundaries and could do things their own way. Now, this Supreme Court case was seen as an attack on Andrew Jackson personally, because again, he had passed that Indian Removal Act and said, I don't care about those land grants. We are moving them out of the way. And Andrew Jackson's response to this case would be, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Again, coming back to that political cartoon of Andrew Jackson as a king, you can see here why people would get that impression, because the Supreme Court's made a decision. He says, good luck enforcing that decision. I'm president, and this is what is going to happen. So by 1835, you're going to have the Treaty of New Ashoda, which had been negotiated to remove a small number of Cherokees, but the government ended up insisting that all Cherokee Indians would move. By May of 1838, after Andrew Jackson is no longer a president, Van Buren would order General Winfield Scott to enforce this treaty and move the Indians off of these lands. You can see on this map here in the dark areas, that's where the Indians were. And this is where we get the Trail of Tears. You're going to have 14,000 Cherokee Indians marched about 1,200 miles to the Indian Territory out in Oklahoma, and over 3,000 of them would die of starvation and exposure. So again, a horrific account of how the Indians were treated here. If you have a chance to go back and read some of the Native accounts of this, it was absolutely horrible how they were treated during this time. And I think if most Americans had known how this treatment was happening, treatment that was happening, they would not have been super happy with this. But this is the Trail of Tears, and again, it's called that because of how many who died on that. So, what would Jackson's legacy would be? He would permanently expand the authority and potential authority of the executive branch. You're going to see that throughout our history, the power of the president has continued to grow, and there's some hallmarks in history of when it grew leaps and bounds. I would say the presidency of Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, all these guys expanded the power of the executive. And again, this went right in line with Jackson's thoughts. The president is the direct representation of the American people. He upheld national authority by threat of military force in dealing with South Carolina, again, showing the power of the federal government. He prevented the overreach, though, of the federal government by undermining the American system and the national bank. And he undermined the constitutional jurisprudence of John Marshall by refusing to enforce his decision in that Worcester versus Georgia case. Eventually, Andrew Jackson, we mentioned Taney, who helped him destroy the national bank. John Marshall would eventually pass, and you would have Roger B. Taney, who would take over as the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which I mentioned here. And you're going to see that Taney, under his time in there, they would reverse a lot of these nationalist ideals and the property rights decisions of the Marshall Court, and it would give some constitutional legitimacy to Jackson's policies endorsing state rights as well as free enterprise. And again, when we're talking about presidents, very, very important, the Supreme Court nominees that they make. You can see Taney here, who would be in here for almost 30 years, almost all the way through the Civil War as well. So these guys are going to have a lot of power, and this means Jackson's policies are going to go on for much longer after he is out of office. You would see the classical liberal doctrine expand in the states. And again, this isn't like conservative liberal like that we think of today. This is liberalism, the classic form of liberalism. 1830 to 60, you're going to see 20 states call conventions to write new constitutions that expand democracy. They would usually give the right to vote to all white men and reapportion state legislatures based on population size. You'd also have nominating conventions, which would begin electing presidential candidates. That would be a big change during this. Instead of having a party do it, you'll have nominating conventions, which we have today. Actually, we've gone even beyond that to the popular, to have the people vote. You'd see more laissez-faire policies, meaning the government's role in the economy would be limited. The idea that the government keeps their hands out of the economy. And you'll see that trickle down to states as well, where the government prohibits states from granting exclusive charters or giving loans to private businesses, and as well as stuff having to do with state debts. So you'll see that grow. And really, this is going to be you're going to see the creation of the second party system. The Whigs would be created to oppose the Jackson and the Democrats. So you're going to see the Republican Party dies out, really just because its people got pulled in multiple different ways. The Whigs wanted a political world dominated by men of ability and wealth chosen by talent. They often appealed to evangelical Protestants. Northern Whigs wanted a return to the American system, whereas Southern Whigs advocated economic development but did not support the high tariffs. And again, you're seeing it again where the Whigs, their party divided into two different factions here. The election of 1836, the Whigs would run 4 candidates with the hope of pushing the election to the House. That plan would fail, and Democrat Van Buren would win the election. And again, that would be the end of Andrew Jackson's presidency right now. You would also see the idea of working man's parties be developed during this time, which embraced the ideology of artisan republicanism. Again, this idea of a small economy based in farming. They joined with the Jacksonians and demanded equal rights and attacked a lot of these charter corporations and monopolistic banks. Again, we said that's why Jackson didn't like the bank, because he saw it as a place of wealth and privilege for the elite. And you would see that with these working man parties, that workers would form labor unions despite the protests of some employees. 1837, you're going to have the Panic of 1837 when the Bank of England sharply curtails their flow of money and credit to the U.S. Americans start withdrawing their money from the banks, which leads them to suspend all their payments of that money. And by 1839, you're going to see the American economy fell into deep depression, which would devastate that labor movement that we were talking about. And you're going to see a lot of people blame the reason for this Panic of 1837 on the banking policies of Andrew Jackson. So that brings us to 1840. The Whigs would blame Jackson's policies. Van Buren faced a lot of backlash because he refused to do a lot, again, with that Jeffersonian idea of the government kind of staying out of things. The Whigs would nominate William Henry Harrison as president and John Tyler as vice president, John Tyler being from Virginia. And they would run on probably the most famous campaign slogan of all time, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. William Henry Harrison had been a general and had been the hero of Tippecanoe, which is a battle against the Indians. This was the first log cabin campaign, which means it's the first time you have two very well-organized parties competing for the election, and you have two people that were born in log cabins. Harrison would win this, but he would give the longest inaugural speech to this point in history. He would die a month later due to pneumonia. Tyler, who leaned very democratic in his policies, would be hostile towards the bank and the American system as well. So it's interesting that you have a Whig get elected, but then John Tyler takes over, and he's someone who was almost a Democrat with his policies during this time. So hope you enjoyed learning about Andrew Jackson there and realizing the important effect that he would have on U.S. history and how he really changed the view of the presidency during his time in there. And again, he is the first truly common man to be president, someone who was born in a log cabin and who, through the military, was able to advance his career. So again, you really want a good understanding of him because he is somebody that pops up on the AP exam quite frequently, especially that cartoon of him standing on the Constitution there. So understand why his opponents did not like him. So hope you have a great day and enjoy learning about Jackson.